Okay, so I'm Al Shalloway. This is one of those sessions where we have one of the ACEs, those are the Amplio consultant educators here at the Amplio University, make a presentation on some topic that uh, they find interesting and I think fits into the Amplio University curriculum. So I'll let Rick Green take a minute or two to introduce himself. But I thought this is useful, and Rick and I have talked about this a few times. And it's interesting how there are tie-ins to with this to some of the things I've been talking about that I hadn't totally expected. So I think it's not only useful, but it's not just a standalone thing. It integrates with a lot of the thought process, systems thinking, information, and coaching. So anyway, I'll leave it to you, Rick. You're in charge.
All
You're in
right.
control. Yay.
Thanks, Al. So welcome all that's present and people potentially watching this recording in some future timeline. So this session is going to be talking about information structures and how broadening accessibility is the key to clarity. So I wanted to open this up with a question. Uh, do you consider yourself capable of conceptual thinking? Which personally I find funny, and I'm curious how other people feel about this. It's a funny concept to think that you know what other people are capable of thinking. Any thoughts there?
Are you preparing us if that's a trick question, or what are you trying to do here, Rick?
Yeah. You should mention why you come from that because people can actually think you have a thought yourself about it when I know that's not what's so.
Oh, sure. So inductive reasoning, right? So I'm going to be talking about that in this session and the idea of going from a observation to a generalization, right? So commonly that's typically how some people think, but not everybody. So I'm curious if anybody else has uh, a maybe a preference on how they do things. And if not, that's fine too. I can just move on. But I'm going to ask this question again at the end to see if it changes during this discussion. All right, so I'm going to move on to the next slide. So basically, the table of contents here is we're going to be talking about a variety of things. So broadening accessibility, triangle of meaning, which is a meaning for meaning, the theory of information mapping, a couple practical uses of structuring information in a particular way, a few ideas of mental models that people can take with them. So when they reach a situation in the future, maybe it would trigger something that would be helpful. Also, a couple of AI prompting techniques that I've used and I've found useful, and some adding some language to it so it's more productive. So the next, oh, and then also you'll see this mind map on the side on the left on the right side. It's basically going through what I just described. So practical applications, mental models, information mapping as a theory, and then showing some practices, and then some AI prompting techniques. So broadening the aperture of accessibility. And to the statement here, information is abundant, yet has decreased accessible information clarity. And then I'm familiar, and I'm sure other people are familiar with the concept of shuhari, which shu meaning traditional way of doing things, ha meaning branching out of that traditional way, and then re meaning finding your own way. And funny thing, I used to think that I was in such a hurry that I forgot my shoes. But now, looking at it through an accessibility lens, I'm thinking more that not all shoes fit. But so I wanted to open up the floor again so you'll see this as a pattern throughout this session that I ask a lot of questions, and I'm going to pause for some time so you can read the questions and reflect on how you would handle that or how it would resonate with you. So I'll give like 30 seconds of silence just so everybody can read the questions and think about them. And feel free to chime in if something comes to mind you want to discuss.
I'll jump in here, Rick. My name is Carlos, and I have a comment regarding question number 3. What's one example of information in the workplace that everybody struggles to understand? And I think I have experienced that, particularly when it comes down to like planning, funding budgets and so forth for the organization. Sometimes, some teams they don't necessarily think in terms of as far as being able to really understand what is going to be coming ahead, and they don't necessarily plan for any requesting any type of budget. But then when an emergency comes, or whenever they're seeing that they have a lot of like maybe bandwidth in order to do some things, they're like come up with some kind of hodgepodge little project, and then wanting to kind of get the request funding, where some other teams, they were very methodical about what are the things that they were planning on doing, and then they requested budget and so forth. And then when it comes down to the overall planning and project planning season and so forth, some targets get agreed on, and then throughout the year, when these kind of emergency projects pop up, they end up kind of impacting the rest of the organization, right? Because there's only a finite amount of funds that got allocated to the different type of things. So one of the things that I've seen the teams kind of struggle is being able to see how are their involvement into the process, how does it impact other teams that they may or may not necessarily they themselves be familiar with. So that's just a little bit of context from the type of things that we do have some challenges on.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's great, Carlos. Does anybody have a comment before I respond? Yeah, so planning for emergencies. It it seems that with teams, so thinking about teams and then organizations, there has to be some type of upstream, right? I don't know if you use the mental model of a river in your organization, Carlos. But just for me, when I'm when I'm thinking about teams and emergencies, I think about like fire departments. And so if there's a fire, typically it goes upstream to 911. What's your emergency? And so that goes out to a bigger organization. And it does need to be prior planned. Otherwise, they run out of funding and fires can't get put out, right? Any other thoughts here or comments?
Rick, I had one other comment. There's this concept of operational definitions. I think it came from Schuhart, and then Deming referred to it. But I think at times the biggest issue I have found is there's not a common understanding of the data you're actually looking at. So not the underlying structure, but when I say something like so I work for a lot of distribution companies. What's a line fill rate for a customer? And there was a calculation, but no one understood, one, what we were trying to measure, and two, how it was actually done. So we had to go back and say, what exactly do we want this information to tell us? Then we can go into and say, okay, now how do you structure the data to get it correctly? So I always kind of think of I know what we think we're looking at, but let's make sure we have the definition correct, and then let's start going after the structure.
Yeah,
Do
I,
those definitions usually come about?
Pardon me?
How do those definitions usually come about?
Those are typically, well, they're usually embedded in the business system. So I'm thinking outside of software development, but typically you have business policies, you have KPIs, you have all these things. And when I've come in to a new role or moved into a different role, one of the first things I look at is, well, what are the KPIs that I'm being held to? And then I say, you know what are we actually trying to do? Another one's like inventory turnover. He goes, well, I know what that is. It's like, well, what do you really want it to tell us? And then you go back and look and go, well, the calculation is completely wrong. And what we thought it was telling us, it is not. And so a lot of times it's legacy information, right, that's sitting there. And then someone has to bring it forward and say, well, I have a problem with this. Because if you go after the data structure, then I'm like, I can solve that data structure problem, but I may still have an issue with the information itself or the KPI itself because it isn't what the organization needs or wants.
Ah,
No,
yeah.
I'm not trying to do a diversion, but I love this. I love this conversation. But I was just saying that I love that step up to say, are we actually looking at the right things in the first place?
Yeah. Yeah. And as we go through this session, I'm curious if something will spark another thought of how that can be done. Cool.
yeah, I wanted to say something that was sparked when Carlos said what he said. And just that question felt completely overwhelming or inaccessible. And when I've read this now, given I've seen this, I read it always as like, what's overwhelming? That's what hit me. But the inaccessible, those are almost two separate questions, actually. Overwhelming is one thing and inaccessible is another. And when I viewed them as two separate questions, I realized, well, we don't know what's inaccessible, but we know there's an amount that's inaccessible. Because one of the biggest problems I find that people miss schedules, why estimates are wrong, is people don't plan for the unplanned work and they create a lot of unplanned work. And so that might be better as two separate questions when I think about it. They're not really related, although they appear to be related when you first talk about it. Carlos's comment made me realize that, well, that's two different things. Anyway.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Now that I'm thinking about it as well, they're related under certain context. Like you said, if you flood something, right? If you flood a system, then it does become inaccessible. I think of like a denial of service,
Yeah.
right? So it overwhelms to the point of inaccessibility.
Yeah. They are related in that way. That's right.
All right. Good questions. Good conversation. So going back to broadening accessibility with shared understanding, I wrote a comment here, information clarity, and how it starts with information accessibility, right? So basically through these steps, this mental model steps, which I'll get to farther down, there has to become like a reconjoin, right? Like a shared meaning. So to Mike's point as well, when you have data, but the data is good under certain contexts, but not others, then what is that upstream process to get it to start to, have cohesion, I guess is the term, right? And that is more like a feedback loop. So now we're going to be talking about one of the mental models, which is called the triangle of meaning. So the triangle of meaning is a older concept, but one that I think has meaning. It has dependency on the perspective of the individual, right? So not all things mean the same things to people, right? So it does depend on that perspective. And I also mean perspective within the organization, right? Executives have a different perspective than managers, than the front line that's executing the work. So it's helpful to have like a meeting of the minds in a sense to say, okay, this symbol, right? In this case, no parking sign, that may mean something to, depending on the perspective of the person, it may mean something different to each individual group. And it's worth having that explicit when you're talking about one thing, one thought, right? So to expand on this, there's three parts, right? So you have a thought referring to a thing, you have a symbol of that thought, and then what it actually stands for, which is the actual thing, in this case, no parking. So you have relationships specifically between objects that I feel is pretty helpful to be explicit about what are we talking about. So between the symbol and the thought, there's a symbolic relationship. And then also between the thought and what you're actually talking about, which is the reference. In this case, they call it the referent. This concept came, I think it's really old actually, from like, so it's, I've heard of it from the 1920s, but I think it goes back to even like 2000 years ago. So it's something you could look up. It's Googleable. And then I also want to create another space here for 30 seconds or so to read these questions, see if anything pops up. Feel free to put stuff in the chat too if you didn't want to chime in, verbally. But if there's nothing else, I'll continue.
I was just going to say, Rick, I think this speaks directly to the operational definitions. I mean, this explains very well why, if you can get there, that's a huge breakthrough versus you don't get those operational definitions, and you are going to have this sort of chaos where people hear you say something and they have no idea,
Right.
or they have a separate or different idea of what you're talking about.
Right. So with the operational piece, are you including things like team charters, onboarding, like anything that's operational, right? So it's a shared meaning.
Yeah, and I just think it's more of just, how do you get that shared meaning? And operational is probably, that's an old term, from Schuhart and then Deming, but I just think that shared meaning is a better way of describing it.
Sure. All right. Thanks, Mike. So now I apply it to a concept about this actual session, which is about information structures. Is or are information structures a pragmatic way to move from chaos to clarity? With the intent, right? The actual referent, the thing of building your own clarity. Because then you could say, if I understand, then that's a building block to shared understanding. And then also creating space so multiple people could speak up when they're not sure, right? Because oftentimes I've seen everybody's nodding yes, they're clear, but somebody isn't clear, and then that creates problems downstream. I think the key takeaway for me on this slide is, how do we own our clarity? So there's this, I'm assuming most people know the story behind the white swan, the black swan concept. I'm going to go through it here in the next few slides, but there's reasoning methods through the lens of the white swan that I think is really useful, and I wanted to explicitly call it out. So using the triangle of meaning method, is the white swan the only swan? Typically, it's the only swan until there's a new swan, right? So at one point, white swans were said to be the only swan until the black swan was seen. And then, so that's basically inductive reasoning in action, observing white swans and making the generalization that all swans are white, right? Uh, so, but this isn't to say that one reasoning is better than or worse, right or wrong than any other. It's just saying that having the mentality of saying, I understand this is a generalization, and there could be something that falls outside that generalization. I'm curious now that I'm thinking about this, that today in business, rapid delivery is like the most important thing, right? So getting it done as quickly as possible. Um, that mentality is useful, but it's also limiting in the sense that if we don't put space in between actions, then there's no reflective period to say, what are we missing? And I think from a development standpoint, from what I can tell, developers often think about what's missing or how can I prevent a problem in the future, where customers are thinking, this is all I've ever seen, so this is true. But developers I've seen take it a step further and say, what variables are possible, right? Does that does that resonate with anyone else? So there's a mentality of customers, and then there's a mentality of developers, and developers typically, or I'm not sure if typical is the right word, extend the the boundaries of constants and variables. Just curious if anybody else is what others are thinking.
You said something that triggered when you said people think about speed, and I thought, well, some people think about speed and some people think about speed of value. And if you look at management, developers, and customers, I think they have three different definitions of what speed means. And that's actually really cool here because you plug that into the triangle here and you'll see that, which is not present for people. That'd be just a good additional slide, I think, as an example, or just caught captured here in this.
Sure, yeah, that's a good point.
See,
Speed of
see, see the thing that's interesting, and this goes to what I've talked about with Flora, is the information is not in the words. The information is how people hear the words. So they're hearing the word differently in all these cases.
right, hearing the word differently. So speed means something different
Speed of
depending.
what?
Yeah,
Speed always refers to a what, but what is that? And that's often not stated because we think we understand what the other person is talking about.
right. Yep. Good point.
I think the other thing that I took away from this is, the human brain is built, we do shortcuts, right? So this way of thinking is if all I've ever seen is a white swan, then that's what I expect to see is white swans, right? So there's a million reasons why you do that, and it's what kept us alive. But that gut instinct is what gets you in trouble very quickly. So you can say, I know that's my rule of thumb, but what's another way to look at this, right? Before I say, yeah, let's go forward.
Right. And I think those that doesn't have to necessarily be the same person, right? When we're talking about teams, there's some people who think differently than others, and I think that's something that is useful to leverage.
That's why I like that book, the Six Thinking Hats. Are you familiar with that?
No, no. What is it?
So there's the concept is you assigned different the hat colors to people, and each hat color represents a way of thinking. So the black hat is sort of the devil's advocate. The yellow hat, I think, is the optimist. And so you can take someone that's typically a devil's advocate and say, today, I want you to be the optimist. And so when we talk about a particular whatever the topic may be, I want you to approach it from the black hat perspective or the optimist perspective. Um,
Yeah.
it's a very it's a pretty long book for a pretty simple concept, a pretty simple concept. But if you look it up, it's called the six think. I think it's the six thinking hats.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'll look
put it
that
in
one
the
up.
chat.
Yeah,
It's a great book.
there it is. Yeah,
I
Well,
never
it's
thought of it as
intuitive,
long, actually, but he does belabor the point.
right.
right? And I mean, it's intuitive when you were saying that. It's like, okay, you just put on a different way of, it's a lens, another way
Hmm.
of looking at it is a lens. Hmm. So transitioning from the white swan, the next one is obviously the black swan. So what happens when somebody discovers a black swan, right? So did I see a black swan? And what I've, from what I understand about the story, it was not immediately accepted that a black swan existed, right? So then the person who first saw the black swan either thinks they're crazy for what they saw or was told they're crazy because there was no such thing before this, right? So it's a useful frame, in my opinion, and I'm curious what other people are thinking here when we live in a world that has these constants, right? We've never seen another thing until that thing is seen. And then we have to make a choice. Did we really detect it? How do we assess it? Right? How do we respond to it? So there's these downstream considerations on, okay, black swan does exist, or the question is, does it really exist? And so there's these subsequent processes that need to be considered.
I go back to Susan's. Well, our focus, we've been talking about the agency. If you don't have agency at all, even though you saw a black swan and you can prove you saw a black swan, you may never bring it up because of the repercussions of bringing it up.
Right, right. Which goes back to the idea of broadening accessibility. Go ahead. Go ahead.
And it also has to do with the nature of concept formation because any given black swan is something you can perceive directly. Any given white swan is something you can perceive directly. So you see white swan, white swan, white swan, white swan, you may think that all swans are white. But if you know that the concept is more abstract than something you can perceive directly, then you might be open to the idea that there might be a black swan or even a purple one.
Yeah, it's the abstract that gets us in trouble a lot. Which is why science is science, right? Be able
Yeah.
to
And the way that you create an abstraction is you take away some of the particularities of a given instance by seeing possibly several instances.
Would you say that that's the value of concepts in general?
I think so. I mean, we're getting into epistemology here, but one of the things that I have read in the past is Ayn Rand's Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, and that is very much what she was saying.
I think for the sake of speed and efficiency or maybe even effectiveness, it's not talked about more, right? Because it slows you down naturally. And I think that's also the value of having that as a specialty versus everybody having it, right? It's not that everybody's going to want to wear that hat. Any other thoughts on white swans and black swans before I move on? So the next section, we're going to switch topics a bit and talk about information mapping as a theory. So there's this information mapping theory. I think it's been around since the 1950s, created by Robert Horn. I'm sure there's many other variations of this, but in this one in particular, I thought was useful because it creates a consistency around how information is created and formatted. So there's 6 principles: chunking, relevance, labeling, consistency, accessible hierarchy, and integrated graphics, all of which can take a chunk of text or words and structure them in a way that is more digestible, right, into bite-sized chunks. So to give an example, this is a before of what people sometimes call a text wall, where it's just a bunch of words. It's like, it's overwhelming. It's going to take me a minute. I can't think of anything else while I'm reading it. And there's really no structure to it other than the traditional one of words in a sentence and sentences are paragraphs. But the idea, and I have some questions here to consider as I move forward. What patterns do you notice of poorly structured information versus structured information? And so this is the before, and then this is an example of after. And I'll go back and forth so you can see them before. And to point out the principles of information mapping, there are labels that are clearly marked, information that's relevant. You have hierarchy, right? Biggest to smallest. And even the way the information is formed is a type of visual, right? So you have actual checklist versus a sentence of what should be in a checklist. I'll give another example. So this is of a team charter, a bunch of information. It's difficult to parse, right? So this is the before. This is an after. And I have the full document in a separate from this. This is just a screenshot. And it's the context isn't as more important as how it's structured in this example anyway.
I want to say that maybe like the first, format, certainly it implies a little bit more, maybe expectation of like more rationale, or being able to really understand and maybe look for like context, or look for maybe, dependencies and things like that, right? Just right off the bat, right? Just because there is a lot more content in there, somebody may say, you know what, I'm not gonna read it, or I'm not going to understand it, and thus I'm not going to engage with it, right? But there's a lot of stuff kind of going on just by the first format, right? And that could be a double-edged sword, right? Because there might be some things that you're not able to distill it down into a much more things. You're prioritizing certain things, right? That you may miss out. So I guess it's just depending on like what is the intention of the creator, how to engage it. But again, if nobody engages with it, it's, did the tree made a sound in the middle of the forest if nobody heard it, type of a thing.
No, that's a good point. And I think there is a trade-off to some degree on the amount of information, which is also why I like AI, because under the right context, you could pull that information on demand versus just having it in some document that you potentially never read because it's just overwhelming, thus inaccessible. Yeah, it's a good point, Carlos.
My gut instinct looking at that wall of of text is, and what a lot of people would do is literally push it into AI. The issue going to be there is, well, even when it's a wall of text, people will take what they want. So they're assigning importance, right? Versus when your after shot is the way you want it to be understood, right? This becomes very obvious how you want it to be understood. So whether you read it or you shove it through AI, now AI, depending on how you prompt it, may completely change what this looks like. But
Right.
that's not the intent that you had, right? So I think that's one of the concerns. I love AI, but one of the concerns with AI would be is if I run into a wall of text, I'll do my own prompting and I'll get the context I want out of it versus the intended context.
Right. Yep. Yep. So it's tailored.
But there was already a way people were addressing this by putting, you would have your summary looking this way, but you would have a link that says for more information. And then people who were more curious or who were a little confused would go and read that extra stuff and come back with questions if they had it.
That's exactly right. Yes. Patrick, it's not obvious in this example, but the intent behind it is to have more hyperlinks so you can go to the source. So it's more of like a on-ramp to information. That's a good point.
This reminds me of a little anecdote that I read not long ago about when ChatGPT came out. It was often the case in corporate email and discussions that people would take an email that they received, feed it into ChatGPT to get a summary, a TLDR, and then have ChatGPT give them sort of a response. But because ChatGPT was structured in such a way that it would use sort of bulleted lists, they would then ask ChatGPT to translate that list of bullets back into normal text so that it looked more like a human being wrote it. And Sam Altman famously said, let's cut out the double translation. Let's just communicate in terms of bullets and bulleted lists, which gets a little closer to the example of how you structure the information here with the team charter. So it reminded me of that you can condense down the content to just a list of bullets, and it's easier to parse and to communicate, even though it's not as traditional natural language format. But
Right.
so that seems to be a bit of a sign of the times of how we communicate.
It is. And it also reminds me of Mike's comment about hats. It depends on the context. So if you need more information, that's a different type of hat.
Well, one thing that I've done in a lot of procedural documentation is I'll have, depending on how complex it is to do, I'll have 2 or 3 columns. The leftmost column is always, what are you doing? And the next column is, if it's really complicated, a high level, how you do it. And the final column is all the links and the exact things you might need to type and so forth. And that worked well in a lot of things that had 24/7 coverage where you didn't really have a chance to do to retrain people on how to do something that has changed, and they're going to walk in and it's going to be a surprise to them.
Yeah, it's also a spoon feeding method, right? So if you get to, oh, I need this information, and then this is enough, you can stop. But if you need more, you just keep going.
And if you do it every night, if you're reminded what it is you're doing, oh, okay, fine, I don't even need to look at it now that I know what it is.
And it's all right there, so there's no more hunting. That's a good point. So that's it for this section. The next section is going to be getting into a few mental models. So let's go into that section. So this is the staircase mental model, and it's based on a general construction regulation. So there's the general construction of a staircase that says each step has to be 7 3/4 inches tall. Does anybody know off the top of their head why this regulation exists?
Does it have to do with like the gait of walking?
Yeah, Carlos nailed it. So, and this goes back to accessibility. So there's a need for the average step, right? So we're thinking about elderly who have to take smaller steps, children who have to take smaller steps, and even our, vertically challenged friends, right? So there's a need for accessibility with steps, and if they were too tall, then it would exclude all of this demographics of people. And I was thinking about that one day and thought this absolutely makes sense for information as well. Some steps are just way too big, and I'm just as guilty as anybody. Like sometimes I just don't think about all the steps and I go right to the next floor, right, in my mind, but that's not going to be useful for other people that aren't thinking the same way I'm thinking, right? So if we can break down information into these clear steps, then it broadens accessibility for other people.
I want to throw something in here, Rick, because I really love this. And I want to just show how this feeds very well with the pickup six model, where we talk about what's the next step, the next step, the next step. So the pickup six model talks about order, and this talks about the gate or how broad it is. So it's nice to think of these two models, how they work very well together.
Yeah. Yeah, good point, Al. Yeah, because the gait, right? So taller people, they could skip steps if they need to. That's easier for people, but can't really go the opposite way, right? You risk fall or injury. Yeah, and same with pickup sticks. So if you're looking for the stick at the bottom, you still got to move all these sticks out of the way in order to get there. Yeah.
I think it's worth noting also that like perhaps when interacting with people, the end goal is not to be able to go to the next floor right away, right? Because some people are going to be able to go to the next floor very fast, and some people are not going to be able to get to that point. But being able to kind of like maybe shape the interaction of like working with other people that, the end goal is, yes, the destination is the next floor. But I think the journey, we need to kind of like almost have that self-awareness as far as, how that the experience is being able to kind of walk with the person that we're interacting or with the team that we are either leading or participating in order to kind of get to that destination. And I think very seldom, I know that I'm at fault at this, that very seldom get to be consciously be aware that, that we are in that space to experience that experience of the interaction and ultimately get to a destination.
Trying to think about how to frame this. So in accessibility terms, it's not always obvious who's excluded, right? And that's why I'm realizing more and more that having shared meaning, shared understanding, it broadens perspective, which then can be used in redesign or in design upfront to reduce rework, which some could argue it slows you down, but in the long run, does it? Under certain circumstances, at least. It's something to think about.
You just said something that really triggered me here about sometimes it slows you down. So I really was a 10x programmer. When people say they didn't exist, well, I was one. I knew others. but I didn't program 10 times faster. I would spend time figuring out a way to solve the problem quicker. And then I would do that. And I was about 3 times faster programming, but a third, at least 3 times, a good part of it was figuring out. What you just said triggered me. I was getting the right information. I was taking the time to get the right information. So when we talk about this information structure, it brings forth the idea that information is important. Do we have the right information and are we looking at it the right way? You've been saying all of this, but this comes to really one of their three questions, three statements that are really critical that I keep coming back to. One is Edgar Schein's, we don't think and talk about what we see what we are able to think and talk about. And you've been talking about this all day. The other one is Ellie Goldratt saying a comfort zone has less to do with control and more to do with knowledge. And if you don't know what these things are, you fall back to your old habits. And the third one, and I've rephrased this, Upton Sinclair says it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it. I rephrase that today to be it's difficult to get a man to understand something if his ego is dependent upon not understanding it, because that's the people part. So I don't know, this is, you've been talking about this. I just wanted to pull it all out because I think it's one of the ways what you're doing here and what I've been talking about with some of the things I talk about are very paralleling each other. They're different, but they parallel each other. And the reason they parallel each other is because of those three things. Can we look at it? I mean, can we see it? Does it give us movement forward and does it give us confidence at the same time? Can we adjust who we are to be, I understand what's going on, not I'm defending my own intellectualism.
Yeah, all good points there. And I was picturing the concrete where before there were wheelchair accessible ramps on concrete on sidewalks. It's easier now to see that we need them, but that's obvious in hindsight. With information in organizations, a lot of that is not hidden, but you don't see it, right? So it's not obvious. And it does take that not only self-awareness, but organizational awareness to say, who else is going to need this?
I could say not talking about it is hiding it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's that old saw that there's never time to do it right. There's always time to do it over. So you don't really save time by making more rework for yourself.
Susan, that's exactly right. It's exactly right.
The cost of the rework is really not necessarily always visible, right? It is like, oh well,
Well, that's a good point.
Last week,
just the way it is.
Yeah, that's the way it is. And last week, I heard somebody mentioning about how sometimes leadership in organizations, they say that how people are like the most important thing, right? And you can kind of parse that a little bit here and there, but I think that there is people may interpret that yes, indeed, people are the most important thing of an organization, but sometimes it comes across as like because they're people, there's a lot of variability, right? Moods and things like that, and it almost in reality, when it comes down to kind of evaluating, saying, yes, if we really believe that people are the most important, element of an organization, we also are kind of like hedging ourselves back because it is made out of people, that there's a lot of variability. And then thus is like, oh, well, I cannot implement a good system in order to really measure, to really kind of capture the rework and things like that in order for us to kind of grow and maybe bring a little bit more awareness and become better humans or better at this kind of team and things like that. But it just kind of it resonated to me with that conversation as far as that because we're people. There is always like room for variability and things like that.
There's a reason the term catch-22 exists. Good point, Carlos. Any other thoughts? So I have another slide here that has just some prompting questions to consider. I'll give 30 seconds or so to read those.
Hmm.
The step height of your information is, and not yours, but in general, it struck me as something worth putting in the back of my head next time. That step height of information. I'm gonna move on to the next part. So this one is steps to stories. And there's a trade-off with data visualization, and that on the left side, we talked about it earlier, we have more information, but is it functional? Can we use it? And so on the right side, we actually have this visual of steps going from raw data to context that we can hit every step, and each step leads into the next one. And there's, to that point, like there's, depending on the context, also depends on your steps. So my steps may look different than your steps, and that's why shared understanding of putting those steps together makes sense. At least it does to me. I'm curious what other people think. So in some cases, information to relationships, there may be another step required in between there that my context or your context may differ.
Just a time check. I don't know if you needed that. I forget how many other slides you have.
We'll get to as many as we can. Um,
Yeah, we are planning to continue this, so if you,
Okay.
that's okay. I mean,
yeah. All
might be
right.
another few weeks, but this is not the end.
Okay.
And I think taking the time to talk has been worth not rushing through it.
I agree. I'm not really interested in a monologue.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, no, this is good. This has been very helpful.
So this slide, I wanted to point out just the differences in the same terms depending on what the action is, right? So action potentials, process of, and act of. When we detect, that is a potential, right? But detection is the process of, and detecting is actually doing it. I'm curious if this is useful or if it's kind of rudimentary um, for people, but to me, it was helpful to at least consider the verbs. How do I say this? How we say something is determinant on what the intention is.
Rick, I think you're making things a little bit more digestible, right? I rather kind of have a smaller, 6-ounce piece of steak than actually having to see the cow and being able to somehow see the
Love it. Yeah.
go from there to something like that.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Thank you.
Appreciate the feedback. So this is another way to see that same piece of information. So on the left side, we have detecting raw data going all the way to new context, right? So it's each stair step moving up to where we were to where we want to go. And so the steps to a new story, I used AI to generate the steps from detect to format using the immune system, how the immune system works. So we have a stability of current state, and then there's some uh, new introduction of, either a virus, whatever foreign object. And so the body first detects it, figures out what it is by making an assessment. Then also depending on that is how it responds. And then that response creates an adaptation, and then the adaptation creates a memory of forming a new memory in the body. So we don't do it consciously, but this is what happens. And I feel like that would be useful in organizations to have a generalization, but it's a holistic generalization. So it can take you from stability to instability back to stability. And then hopefully I'll try not to rush this, but it's kind of it's a useful mental model with the kitchen sink. I lived in this apartment once where the sink, when the stream would go directly down the drain, it would actually clog it, which made no sense to me. It was counterintuitive, but at the same time, because the water didn't have time to create that nice spiral, uh, that normal sinks, like in this position, it knows how to separate the water, and that separation creates the spiral, then it wouldn't clog. And I felt like this was a useful model with workflow and how we actually redirect work into deliberate steps so it doesn't clog things downstream. One of those aha moments. And so this is just that basic same point, being explicit. So information as water goes in different directions. And so the stream, like if you looked at this one, I don't know if you could see my mouse, but the stream behind may have more steps because there's just a longer distance, or maybe that information would need a triage team, something like that in an organization where the stream going directly down the drain is more of a, urgent need or something like that. So you can use this mental model depending on the context. How we doing on, it's noon now, Al.
Yeah. Okay. Well, why don't we wrap this up?
Okay.
Anything you need to say or any feedback from people about this?
Well, there is more. Let me figure out which.
I mean, we can go a couple of minutes later.
Okay.
I think that what could be interesting is tying this to what the other aspects of Amplio together in the next session, and then you take it further. So what do you need to have a closing? What's really critical that you haven't mentioned in your mind? We can go a few minutes later.
Okay. Let's see. Basically, I'll just wrap up. There was a section about AI prompting techniques, but it would take too long to get through, so we can hold off till the next one. But I wanted to end back on this question, which we started with, was, do you feel like because of this session, your answer changed from the beginning? Do you feel like you're capable of conceptual thinking where before you didn't think you were capable? Or maybe you just knew you were capable the whole time.
More capable.
More. Okay.
To me, it's not so much about my ability to do conceptual thinking or to understand the concepts behind a document, but it reminds me a little bit of what Al once said about a coach, right? The idea is to get the people that are trained or coached to understand something. And if whether you as a coach already understand it or not is less important, and how you interact with them, how you present it to them, what size of steps and what sequence of steps in the pickup sticks model you employ can make all the difference between them getting it or just being confused. And the agency notion that Susan and Al and others have always emphasized is that we can and we should take responsibility as coaches to present the information in such a way that it's more likely that people can follow it and digest it and sort of understand it. So that to me is one of the main takeaways from this presentation, that we have this responsibility to present in such a way that it's easier for the audience to follow along.
Awesome. You said it better than I could have, Thomas. But to that point of accessibility, you're right. It's not a matter necessarily if the coach gets it. It's if the person you're coaching gets it. And really, you don't know that until that person applies it.
That's the outcome that we are looking for, and by which we should judge our own efforts.
With that point in mind, it sounds like, which I'm guessing here, it sounds like this was accessible. All right. Well, I appreciate everybody's time and attention on this. I'll keep plugging away at it, and yeah, appreciate
Yeah,
the
this is a
feedback.
good job. This underscores those three quotes I mentioned. It's really nice. So good job.
Thanks, Al.